Computer-generated chess problem 2773 by the world's most advanced automatic chess problem composer, Chessatica. Well, what do we have here? A queen and two rooks versus queen and rook. But the rook on e1 is in a position to be captured by the king. So what if white does something like rook on the g file to g1? This, even though it defends the other rook, is actually a critical mistake. And here's why. Queen to d2 check. If king to e4, queen to d4 is mate, the rook has to intervene. Queen captures rook with check. King to g4, queen to d4, check. King to h3, and rook to h5 mates. You probably didn't see that one coming. Okay, but let's say you did. So rook on the g file to g1 is a mistake, but what about rook on the e file to g1? Well, that's an even bigger mistake, because queen to d2 again check. The rook on g4 blocks the king's flight square, so the king can only move to e4, and queen to d4 mates. So maybe you're starting to wonder, even though white is technically ahead in material, he seems to be in an inferior position. Okay, what about rook on the e file to e4? What about that? No, queen to d2 check again, rook to e3, and queen captures rook with mate. Again, the rook on g4 blocking the king's flight square. The queen on c8 seems to be useless, or on a very poor square relative to the other pieces in this position. Okay, what about queen to c1? How about that? Okay, queen to d2 is no longer possible, but rook to d4 check is. King to e5, queen to d5 check, king to f6, queen to f3 check, king to e7. Capturing the rook would be a mistake because queen to e3 check, king to g2, rook to g1 check, and white is winning here and will checkmate in fact. So the queen can't capture the rook but can move to b7 in this position. King to f6, queen to f3 check, king to e7, queen to b7 check, and this is a draw by perpetual check. King to e8 is a mistake because queen to d7 leads to a forced mate soon enough. Okay, so enough fooling around. Have you seen the solution? This is a chess problem, so the solution is probably going to be quite interesting or unexpected. Here we go. Okay, the unthinkable. White has a rook on e1, which is in a position to be captured. So what does he do? He offers black the other rook as well. Rook to g2 check. What happens if black decides to take this rook on g2? Well, then white wins even more quickly with queen to g4 check. If king to h2, queen to g3 mates. If king to f2, queen to g3, or even queen to g1 mates. Okay? So black's other alternative is to capture the rook on e1, and white proceeds now with queen to c1 check. Black can only intervene. White checks on g1 if king to f2 or even king to e2, queen to e3 mates. The rook on d1 blocks the king's flight square, and white wins this with equal material as black, all in 4 moves. How amazing is that? Now, another interesting thing about this position is that the next best line is also a rook sacrifice. Rook to f1. Now, if king captures rook, queen to c1 check, king to e2, queen to e3 check, king to d1, rook to g1 check, king to c2, rook to c1 check, king to b2, queen to c3 mates with the queen on a2, blocking the king's flight square. If king to e2, white still doesn't care if he loses a rook. Rook to g2 check, king captures rook, rook captures queen, and as you can see from the analysis, mate will soon follow. But what about if king to d3? Well then, rook to d1 check, queen to d2 cross check, and either rook can capture the queen with mate. So it turns out in this position, the rook on e1 is far better off being sacrificed. Do you think you would have come to the same conclusion? Do you think you could have composed something like this with these pieces? Why not give it a try? Until next time.
Chessthetica's Book of Chess Constructs, Volumes 1 through 5. Available on Amazon.